gives me great pleasure to welcome you to this event. I want to introduce Professor Rakesh Basant to you. He's here this semester. He's a visiting professor at the School of Business from the Indian Institute of Management, Ahmedabad, which is one of the best business schools in India. There he is a professor of economics and is the chairperson for a very innovative center on innovation, incubation and entrepreneurship. It's a center which tries to encourage entrepreneurship and actually germinate new companies. So it's a very interesting and path-breaking institution. He's the chairperson of that center. His research interests are very wide-ranging. He has done work on patents and pharmaceutical industry, and that's how that's the common link between his work and my current work. He's focused and also done some very interesting work on Muslims and higher education. In fact, he was the member of Prime Minister's high-level committee on the status of Muslims in India, which was called the Sanchar Committee. It's again a very interesting and policy institution. He participated in that to collect data and do an empirical and rigorous assessment of the status of Muslims. He's received a number of fellowships, and he's also taught at Yale University a few years ago. His, of course, list of publications are quite extensive, but so I won't go into them. But today he's going to talk to us about who participates in higher education in India. So welcome, Rakesh.
Thank you very much, Asima. It's a pleasure to be here, and thanks very much for giving me this opportunity to share with you some results of some ongoing work that I am doing. A part of the presentation here is based on a paper that has been published recently in the Economic and Political Weekly with the co-author Geetanjali Sen. There is a bit in it which is based on something which we have done subsequently, but the core of the argument essentially comes from that paper. So let me start with why we started to do this exercise a couple of years ago. Many of you might know that the Indian government gives reservation or affirmative action for scheduled castes and scheduled tribes for higher education and for public sector jobs. Sometime in the 80s, they also reserved a quota of jobs for other backward classes in the government sector again. In 2006, the Government of India decided that they will also reserve seats for the other backward classes in higher education. And it was a challenge in the courts, and around 2008, the Supreme Court gave the judgment that the Government of India can go ahead and reserve seats for other backward classes in the higher education institutions in India. Now, while this whole process of deciding whether to give quotas for the backward classes was going on, an old debate around reservation and affirmative action got rekindled, and a lot of people started to write in the media about the efficacy and relevance of this kind of affirmative action in the context of India. And while we read that literature and that kind of a debate that was going on, I got a feeling that nobody actually knows enough about the participation of different groups in higher education. There has not been any rigorous and systematic study of who participates in higher education. And most of the debate revolves around very simplistic measures and simplistic notions of participation in higher education of different groups. And by then, people had started to analyze data from the National Sample Survey, which is the largest sample survey in India done by the National Sample Survey Organization. And data was available for the backward classes, SCs and STs, as well as for religious groups. So we thought that why not start analyzing this data rigorously and figure out whether there are in fact deficits in higher education for certain groups. Deficits meaning whether the participation in higher education is very different from their share in the population. And people were using different kinds of measures very, very loosely. So we thought that we need to think about this measurement issue a bit and apply these measures to the National Sample Survey data and see what emerges out of it. So it started as, in some sense, a very empiricist exercise. With a curiosity to figure out what's happening in terms of participation in higher education, because there was not much data available. At the background was the belief that if you are able to generate good data on participation of different groups in higher education, you might have a more informed debate, and if policymakers use these data to take some action, it might be more acceptable, because many of you might know reservation is a very contested issue in India, and partly because there is not enough information on what's going on, and partly, of course, it's highly political. So what we said, okay, if you have to measure participation in higher education of different groups, what are the different ways in which you can look at it? So we said, okay, there are, broadly speaking, two ways of looking at it. One, whether I have finished a university degree, that is, if I'm a graduate or more, so I have attained a degree. That's one way of looking at participation. And the other one is whether I'm studying for a degree. So the first one gives you a stock measure, whether what proportion of people in a particular community or a group are actually graduates or more. And the other one gives you a flow measure of how many of them are currently studying in college and who would get a university degree soon. So if you're looking at a stock measure, if you're looking at the percentage of people in different communities who are graduates, it sort of gives you a historical, it's a historical baggage. If the participation was not very high initially, so you will find people in the 50 to 75 age group or 40 to 75 age groups being much smaller in proportion. And therefore, the stock measure captures what happened historically, while the flow measure gives you a more current kind of a picture of what's happening in participation. So that was the first kind of a dichotomy we focused on. Now, given this broad dichotomy, we came up with three measures which we thought were sensible measures to look at. One was to say, okay, you have to be around 20 years to become a graduate. So you take all the people in a specific group which are 20 years plus and say what proportion of this population has got an university degree or a graduate degree. And we call it all generation stock measure. That is, 20 years plus, the entire generation basically captures about 2.5 generations. So it gives you an idea of the stock of graduates in different groups. And if you are comparing the population share of different groups in this stock and the population share among the graduates, that gives you the deficit. So if the proportion of people in 20 plus age group is say 50%, and your share in the same age group among graduates is 20%, then there is a 30% deficit, right? So it covers the entire group. Then we said, okay, if you want to get a picture about what has happened recently in terms of attainment, let's look at a smaller age group. And we said 22 to 35 population and do exactly the same thing, which will give you what we call a current stock measure. So it's the current generation stock measure, while the first one giving you the all generation stock measure, and second one gives you a current generation stock measure, people who have finished their degrees recently. And finally, for those who are actually studying in the university right now, we said, okay, we'll take 17 years to 19 years, 29 years age group for which the data is available for currently studying students, or take 18 years to 25, people who are likely to be in college. So this gives you a current generation flow measure. So you have these three measures.
So the second and the third are they are subsets of the first, right?
These are currently studying, and these are who have completed the degree. So this is still a stock, this is a flow measure. These people will become graduates in times to come.
But the second is a subset of the first.
Second is a subset of the first, that's right. Okay, the other question that came to our minds was that many of the people who are in the 20 plus age group population or 22 to 35 age group population may actually not have completed their schooling. Because in order to go to college, you need to complete your school education. Now, if you have a large proportion of people in this age group who have not gone to school, they obviously can't go to college. So therefore, one needs to start worrying about differences in eligibility to go to college across groups that you are interested in. So then we said, okay, if you want to fine-tune this measure, these three measures, can we look at a subset of the total population who had completed school education and who was eligible to go to college? So then we got another set of three measures where we were computing the same ratios of share of share of graduates or studying population, the total population in their age group. But the only difference was that in this round we were only picking up those who were eligible to go to college instead of counting all those who were in that age group. So if you, and this is something which I'll come back to towards the end of my presentation, that if we find that there are significant differences among the eligible and the total population, then what should be the policy intervention sort of one needs to think about, and whether reservation is the best policy option to enhance eligibility is an issue which one needs to worry about, and I'll come back to that. Of course, there is a minor data issue. Those of you who are interested in that, we can discuss that. We tested for age sensitivity across different age groups because age reporting in India is not so robust. But the results that I'm going to share with you do not change. We ended up, I am sharing with you the 17 to 29 age group figures because that's the largest sample. And we thought, and this is the largest age group for which the data is available. So if you have any questions on that, we can come back to that later on. Okay, so that was for defining participation in higher education. Now, which groups are we interested in? And we may be interested in a variety of groups. Which groups are there for which data is available? Now, on the basis of the data from the National Sample Survey, these are the categories which we could define, which combine caste and religion. I don't know, do I need to define other backward classes? Or?
Yes, please. Yes.
Yeah. So scheduled caste, and I have an expert here, so he can correct me if I. So the scheduled caste and scheduled tribes were defined when the constitution was written, and these scheduled tribes are typically a set of people who have stayed away in places far away from the mainstream, and scheduled castes were those who were broadly untouchables, and both these were historically disadvantaged, and the constitution makers thought that they should be given some advantage in admissions in universities, colleges, and for jobs. So it was right from the beginning, the reservation for these groups was put in place. And the idea at that time was that it will be there for 10 years, and after 10 years they will be capable enough to compete effectively with other groups, and it will be withdrawn. That, of course, did not happen, and so many years after independence, we still have reservation for scheduled castes and scheduled tribes. Now, OBCs are other backward classes, and backwardness is broadly defined in terms of social and educational backwardness. Not so much in economic terms, but it is some kind of a, they move sort of together. But the way other backward classes are defined, they need to be defined in terms of social and educational backwardness. And so you have two kinds of lists which the federal government and the state governments come up with on the basis of surveys and other kind of studies that they do. You create a list of caste groups who are other backward classes and who can get benefits from these reservations. Often the state lists and the central list do not match. There is variance around that. But broadly speaking, these are other lower caste in the caste hierarchy in India who have been given the benefit of affirmative action. Now, the interesting thing is that when these surveys are done by the National Sample Survey, they ask them about their religion as well as castes. So the respondents tell us whether their caste backgrounds, although by definition Muslim religion does not have any castes, whether they were other backward classes or they were scheduled castes or scheduled tribes. So you can sort of cross-tabulate the caste and community groupings to come up with these 7 categories that we have come up with. So Muslim OBCs here also include us Muslim SCs and STs. The percentage was so small that we could not keep them as a separate category. So Muslim OBCs include that. But constitutionally, Muslim OBCs are also eligible for affirmative action. So if you are a Muslim and you belong to one of the groups which has been classified as the backward class in your state or by the federal government, then you can get benefits of this affirmative action. But if you are SC/ST Muslim, then you are not eligible for affirmative action. And if you are not a non-SC/ST, non-OBC Muslim, then you are not eligible for affirmative action. Other minorities are Christians and Jains and Sikhs, which are generally better off communities in India. These are categories that we had generated at some time, which basically uses the poverty line. So this is the lowest rung in terms of income, this is the highest. In the estimations that I have done, I have used a continuous variable. So your per capita household income is used as one variable. Here I've used this just to show you some numbers to give you a sense of what's happening. Okay, so given these categories, what do we find? These are some numbers. So the first one is the all generation stock measure, second one is the current generation stock measure, and this one is the current generation stock as flow measure, and these are the 3 which are for the eligible population. This is for the all population, this is for the eligible population. Now the most striking discovery that we had when we started to look at these numbers, just to sort of put the stark figures here. So even if we say that the current generational flow measure is the best measure, which according to me is the best measure because it gives you the current situation, you see that the proportion of SCs, Hindu SCs in this age group who are currently studying is slightly more than 3.5%. And for the Hindu upper castes, it is about 12%, 11.5%. So you're basically talking about a 4-fold difference, 3.5 versus 11.5. So that's the 3.5 times higher participation. But as soon as you move towards eligibility, right, then you find that the proportion here is 43.5 or 43.6, and it is 59. Right? So the gap dramatically decreases. So as soon as you start looking at eligible population who are eligible to go to college, then the gap between the high caste and the lower caste dramatically declines, and it is less than twice. Right? So the point therefore is that something happens at the crossing the threshold of school education, which means that a small proportion, very small proportion of people actually are able to reach higher education. But once they cross the threshold, the differences decline dramatically. So that's when you can look at these numbers in greater detail later on. But the key point that I want to drive home is that the Now this is another way of looking at the same numbers, where you are comparing the community or group's share in the population and their share in among graduates or studying kind of population. So if we look at the last three columns, for example, Hindu SCs have 18% share in the total population, they have 10% share in the studying population, and they have about 10% share in the eligible population. So their share in terms of eligible population is actually slightly higher than who are studying, right? So then the gaps start to look much smaller. 10% are eligible. If you take the 18 to 25 age group, 13% are eligible to go to college, but 10% are going. So the gap is about 3 percentage points, right? Similarly, if you look at Hindu upper caste, their share is 41.6% in the eligible population, 41.8% are going. So approximately the same, slightly more. So there is no deficit, there is a slight surplus. So once again, the point which I am trying to harp on is that as soon as you start looking at eligibility, or start looking at eligible population, the gaps across socio-religious groups start to decline dramatically. The same I have not shared the economic group data in these slides because it was becoming far too many slides. Here, once again, if you take the share of extremely poor populations, about 5%, studying is 1%, the gap is 4%. But if you look at the eligible population, the gap is only 0.4%. So once again, as soon as you start looking at eligible population, the deficits start to decline dramatically. Okay, so we controlled for eligibility, but participation in higher education can change with various other factors, can be controlled for them as well. One can say that it will vary across social-religious groups. So we want to figure out whether the community or groups participation is significantly different from others, but it can also can be affected by whether I am a woman or a man. It can be affected by my economic status of the household. It can be affected by whether I'm in a rural area or an urban area. It can be affected by which state I come from. The heterogeneity at the state level is extremely high in India. So if I am way down in the southern region of Tamil Nadu or Kerala, the participation rates are significantly higher as compared to, say, Bihar or UP, where the participation rates are much lower. So need to control for all that. Household size gives you an idea of how many children would go to school, so you need to control for that as well. And age, of course, if you are a 18-year-old, you are likely to be in college much more than if you are a 40-year-old, so you need to control for age. And finally, you have to control for eligibility that we spoke about. So once again, those of you who are econometrically inclined, we can talk about the equation that I ran. But basically, what we were trying to do is to run probits to calculate the probability of participating in higher education or attaining higher education, and how that probability changes depending on which category I belong to. If I am a Muslim, whether the probability of being in higher education is higher as compared to Hindu SC. If I belong to upper caste household, is the probability of my being in college is higher than the other group, controlling for the effects of these. Controlling for the fact that I come from a poorer or a richer household, controlling for the fact that I'm in rural areas or urban areas, or which state I come from, household size, age, and so on. So that's the kind of exercise we did, and I can discuss the details of that. But what do we get? So this, just to sort of present the result simply, I ranked the probabilities of different groups. So if you are looking at the current generation stock measure, I have left the all generation stock measure, which is the 2.5 generations. But if you look at the current generation stock measure, what you find is that Hindu upper castes are at the top of the hierarchy, but other minorities are not significantly different, so they get the same rank. So other minorities and Hindu upper castes are on top of the hierarchy if you look at the current generation stock measure of attaining higher education. Hindu OBCs are number 2, right? Hindu STs are number 3, Muslim OBCs are at the bottom of the ladder, right? As soon as you move from current generation stock to flow, you see that the rankings start to change. And you find Hindu upper castes are no more on top of the hierarchy. Hindu scheduled tribes come on top. That is after controlling for all the other factors, which state they come from, everything else is being controlled for. So you're basically attributing this ranking to the status or the socio-religious status of the. So the Hindu scheduled tribes have done exceedingly well their participation, and this is based on 2004-2005 data. We have done this for 2005, 2006, 2006, 2007, which are smaller samples, and also for 99-2000, which is a large sample. The broad results remain the same. The rankings slightly get modified, but that's the. And when you get to stock eligible, once again, Hindu upper castes are on top, STs number 6, but flow eligible once again, STs have done extremely well, right? Now one thing which I forgot to mention, which was my punchline in some sense, that I forgot, Hindu OBCs have a 27% reservation in higher education. Their share in the higher education studying population is 28.2%. So they have already crossed the reserved quota. So if you look at this, and if you combine this with Muslim OBCs and assume that all of them are also eligible, then the share becomes 31%. So if you go by these numbers, and I'm not saying that policy should be defined on the basis of these numbers, then the idea of 27% should be their requirement to take care of the so-called deficit does not make sense. Right? So they already have. Okay, so that was urban. Once again, if you look at rural areas separately, another interesting thing happens. Muslims start to do better. Muslims in general, even in the Sacha Committee report, if you look at urban areas, they are much worse off than in rural areas. So you start to see among the eligible, Muslims start, after controlling for other things, Muslims start to do STs, of course, continue to do, the probabilities start to go up, but Muslims start to do well as well. So what does this all mean in terms of, is there a hierarchy, and is that hierarchy changing over a period of time? So the differences across socio-religious categories decline significantly once you control for eligibility. And in the second round, if you control for other factors, in many cases, these differences become insignificant. So once you control for eligibility and the region you come from and the per capita household expenditure and so many other factors that we could control for, there are several things which the data is not available, so we couldn't control for. The dramatic decline in the differences is very stark.
But Rakesh, when you say the differences become insignificant if you control for other factors,
right,
then that means that your ranking don't mean anything? I mean, in the sense that in terms of what would the rankings mean then?
Yeah, so okay, that's a very good question. The ranking are not so robust anymore. Right? So the ranking question would be, then we'll have to then look at the significance between these two. Between these are 1 and 2, right? Whether these are significantly different or not, right?
Right.
So one is then trying to, so you have a coefficient for Muslims, you have a coefficient for SCs, and you try and figure out whether they are significantly different or not, right? So this is not capturing, so if you look at the paper, it will give you which of these is significantly different from each other. So these rankings are not very robust in the sense that I can't really tell you that the coefficient of this ST is the highest, but it may not be significantly different from Muslim
The
in general.
distance between them
So
is
distance
not-
is not so. That one needs to. You have to. We can talk about that separately because But you're right. This ranking is only based on the coefficient numbers. They may not be. But that's why I added that line that there is. Even this ranking is not so robust. I mean, it's not so stark. I mean, the hierarchy. So many of these ranks are sort of collapsible. They can, if you do statistical tests.
Excuse me?
Yeah.
When you say the scheduled tribes done extremely well,
Yeah.
shouldn't you really qualify that and say the eligible persons among the scheduled tribes
Right.
have done extremely well?
Right.
Because it may be that because of the small number coming through the pipeline
Right.
of eligibility,
Right.
the scheduled tribes as a whole are falling behind,
Mhm.
or, you know, so that, it seems to me I'm sort of curious what kind of judgments you can make to the extent that these reservations are supposed to have some component of representation in them. The notion may be mistaken, but certainly the notion on which they proceeded is that the people who gain the education or the government job in some sense act as representatives of the total group and in some way induce to the welfare of the total group. Now, that assumption could be investigated separately.
Right,
But
right.
the question is, as long as that representative function is there, it seems to me to separate out the eligible group, you can only talk about success in a very limited way, because in some sense, that is, when you say a group has done extremely well,
Mm-hmm.
that could be due to their success in their higher studies, or it could be due to abysmal failure of their CAS fellows at the lower end. So it's a very ambivalent thing.
Yeah. So and that helps me clarify what I was saying. When I said extremely well, I meant only in a relative sense. That is, groups which have increased their ranks dramatically. So if you look at absolute numbers, STs may not be doing as well at all. Although the ST story is quite interesting, that even if you look at the not all population, that is not only eligible, but all population in the furrow group, their probability of participation is the highest. And I mean, I personally think, although we need to do some analysis of the data that is available, it's in some sense an impact of the Northeast phenomenon in India. And you have a very high participation in education, school education in the Northeast, partly because of Christianity, partly because of other factors, and these people start coming into the higher education. So a large proportion of the ST population, which is actually getting into higher education, comes from the Northeast, where educational institutions have improved. Yeah.
I'll let you finish, but the Hindu scheduled tribes is not Northeast. That has to be other minorities, right? Because there are no Hindus in Nagaland. They're all Christians.
No, so they are, they're not no Christian in Nagaland, but there are scheduled tribes in Tripura. They are they're in the other Nagaland. There is no in Meghalaya. There are fewer of them. In Assam, there are large number of them. So you're right. I mean, that's true. Okay, so you had another interesting point, which okay, let me finish and I'll. Okay, so. So if one controls for eligibility and other factors, not only the differences decline dramatically, the bottom of the ladder groups, Muslim OBCs and Muslims, start to improve their ranks. So what am I saying? I'm not, at this stage, I am not very sure of what one can make out of this. So a very simple conclusion is that one needs to understand a little better this transition for different generations, and data is available to explore the intergenerational transition in participation in higher education. And the comparison of stock and flow measures give you an idea. That's an interesting thing to look at. And the other thing which comes out very clearly is that among the eligible population, even if you forget about all the other controls, the differences across groups are not very high, and underprivileged groups are not so worse off as compared to the non-eligible kind of, so all kind of a population. But on the basis of this data, Hindu OBCs don't seem to be the most disadvantaged. If at all you want to use this data to suggest policies, affirmative action or otherwise, it's the SCs and Muslim OBCs. Muslims in general, Muslim OBCs in particular, which seem to be at the bottom of the ladder in terms of participation, and they need to be the focus of policy attention. And this may also have some implications for the quotas, if you want to put quotas at all, what the reservation percentage should be. Now, the other thought or other idea that emerges from this analysis is that the focus potentially should be on facilitating the crossing of the threshold, because once you cross the threshold, the probabilities of different groups in participating in higher education are not very different, and therefore should the policy not focus on crossing the threshold. Now, some people might argue that reservation in higher education is one incentive to cross the threshold, but the point is, if you look at the absolute numbers, it has not helped people cross the threshold. Very small proportion of SCs and STs and Muslim OBCs are actually completing school education, and therefore to say that reservation in jobs and higher education will create incentives for such households to go to school, complete school, and become eligible to go to higher education and then get a job, that doesn't seem to be working. And therefore, one needs to figure out other ways of supply of schools or other kind of factors which might be significantly more important in crossing the threshold than reservation. That's one thought that comes to mind. And the other thought is that since we see such changes in participation over a period of time, should the policy not worry about changing these proportions from time to time, depending on what's happening to participation for different groups? But of course, we have seen that policies don't change very easily. So that may be something which is unlikely to happen. Now, the other, I'll finish with this. Weisskopf has done an extensive work on affirmative action, and he has these criteria which he thinks are important for affirmative action policies to be effective. He's talking about time-bound and flexible, changing circumstances, which I just said politically is probably not possible. Community should be fairly homogeneous, and the selected ones should have reasonably good chance of success. Now, if you use this criteria and the current Supreme Court judgment that only the poor OBC should be given reservation in higher education, and not the ones who are the creamy layer, on the richer ones, relatively richer ones. So this seems to be counterintuitive in the sense that if you come from a very poor background, your chances of being capable enough to deal with higher education is not likely to be as high as if you're coming from a relatively richer household. And the other thing which he has very strongly argued, that affirmative action alone is not going to help. You need to do several other things in terms of financial and other support. And financial support and reservation are not substitute strategies. They are complementary political policy interventions, and they need to be looked at that way. But none of these conditions are satisfied. Now, if that is the case, and you continue with reservation without looking at detailed data, what is the basis of that, is the general question. Now, the So what are the alternatives? Do we have any other alternatives? The thing which such a committee started to think about, unfortunately there has not been much discussion around that point. Can we think in terms of non-quota based affirmative action policies? One, of course, is supply of educational institutions, and some people have written in small survey-based studies to argue that availability of decent schools in the vicinity affects student participation significantly, and crossing the threshold becomes much easier then. The other thought which we flagged in the report, and which I am flagging again here, can we think in terms of incentives for diversity for educational institutions, private educational institutions, as well as private employers, and say that if you have a diverse student population in your college, you will either get a tax break or a grant. If you have a more diverse employee population, you will get tax breaks or a grant. Now, can we start thinking around those lines if the reservation policy for improving the participation in higher education has not worked? Thank you.
This is a little bit different, out of my field, but if I could ask or suggest a conclusion on the basis of the data you presented, I'd like to ask if what my conclusion is correct or not, which is basically that the affirmative action or reservation works as in terms of the data you've seen, and that so that more attention needs to be paid to increasing the number of people who are eligible.
Yeah.
And then those other suggestions at the very end were just sort of alternatives to the affirmative.
Yeah, I mean, the main point is that if you look at the data, the basis for providing reservation for OBCs, at least empirically, there may be other reasons for giving them quotas, but if you look at the numbers on the basis of deficits, it doesn't make sense. So that's the other generic. Yeah.
I want to ask if you know about the gender statistics within the statistics
Yeah.
that you quoted,
Yeah.
and the other question is this kind of follows on what Kathy's saying. So is this whole idea of reservations aimed at keeping kids in school? Is that what's set out? It seems to be that this enormous thing overlooked, like having toilets in school, for instance.
Yeah. So when I say that, why don't you look at helping crossing the threshold and to focus more on school education than on higher education for these groups? The answer is that affirmative action is creating incentives for that. But the point is it assumes that there is supply.
Right.
So you're right. I mean, that's precisely the point.
Is yours quite groundbreaking in that? Has nobody pointed that out before?
I mean, people are pointing that out, and the gender thing, I mean, I have these numbers. You find that within these groups, and if you look at women, their participation increased significantly more dramatically when they become eligible. So the jump is dramatic. I mean, they are, so once you sort of cross that threshold, if you are a rural Muslim OBC woman, your chances become significantly higher.
But it assumes that school where you feel safe and
Yeah.
everything helps.
So once they have crossed all those constraints and they have finished school, so there is some kind of a self-selection might be happening at that stage. Yeah. Yeah.
I just want to say that before I ask my question, this is a wonderful data set and very interesting analysis, and I think everyone who has studied the subject should be grateful to you for opening up. It's
Coming from you is quite a
very,
compliment.
very good. Now, one factor that intrigues me here is that, in some sense, you've taken higher education as a kind of undifferentiated mass. And it seems to me that the real competition, now that so many thousands of colleges have opened in every district town. But that the real goods that are being distributed by affirmative action presumably is not an opportunity for college education, but an opportunity for education in
Top
you might
tier.
say, the elite or the top 20 or 30% of institutions.
Right.
That's the scarce good that's being distributed by these policies, not just getting into a college because the colleges are everywhere and so forth. So
Right.
in some sense, if the analysis permitted you to separate out, say, 2 layers of higher education, call them higher education 1 and higher education 2, the question is, what do you think the results might look like, if we did this just for higher education 1?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very, very good question. The problem is that the data set does not permit you to classify education institutions by quality. So what we are doing currently, so to pursue the kind of line you have just suggested, is to look at engineering and non-engineering. That is possible to do. So that we are doing right now. The hypothesis is that the participation of SCs and STs and OBCs will be significantly more in the non-engineering disciplines. But we have the data and we are looking at that right now. Yeah.
Thank you so much for the talk. Everybody else has shared. I feel like it's been a very long time I've heard people talk about this in detail or even explore it. So I'm very interested to see where the study will go, where you're taking it. I had a couple of questions on both what you think where the study can go to, in the sense of, is there a possibility, for example, to look at post-flow data or to follow what happens when you have this kind of participation in higher education, whether in terms of cultural capital, people are equipped to go through what you're talking about, the second layer of education, through the IITs, through the IIMs, and what happens in terms of a highly competitive job environment once you go through education,
Right.
to follow through with affirmative action. And with the data itself, I'm sort of interested in the slide you had on the various factors you have to control for.
Right.
Rural, urban, gender, all of this. And in relation to that, how your ranking suffers or actually has significance. Controlling for gender, rural, urban thing, eligibility at a certain level. And so we all know that OBCs have significantly more political clout in so many other states of
Right.
India. So I'm wondering at the possibility of perhaps doing this state-wise rather than doing NSS nationwide survey, and whether that might give you a better way of addressing policy.
Yeah, once again, a good question, and we are doing it. First to answer, give a clarification, the numbers which I gave control for all the factors that I listed. So the rankings or the probabilities control for that. But you're absolutely right, not only you have supply side effects at the state level, different states have had different histories of affirmative action. So we are trying to figure out some states in the south, mostly Tamil Nadu, and some states in the north. The issue is to get the right sample size. Because the state sample is large enough, but you need to have decent sample of people in higher education. Only then you can actually generate this kind of a cross classification. So the way to go forward, replicate this for different years, that has already been done, results are similar. To try and figure out whether we can control much better for the supply side of schools and institutions. 3, whether we can do the quality stuff that he spoke about. And 4, whether we can generate state level more nuanced kind of understanding of these processes. To follow on the first question that you had asked, GMOL was starting to do something on following students once they cross, once they pass out, and see what happens over a period of time. We had approached the Jawaharlal Nehru University. They have a process of affirmative action, and they have all the data computerized. And we had approached them to share the data with us to see what happens to their marks over a period of time. So they may have, the first quarter they may not be doing well, what happens to them over a period of time, and then take a small sample of these people and see what happens after they graduate. But they said no. They're not analyzing it themselves, they're not sharing it either. So, but the question is very valid, yeah.
And this brings me to the question of reliability of self-reported data.
Right.
And I know that you probably have already dealt with this, but I mean, how many of those HSTs are really HSTs and not HUCs that are reclassified?
Right.
And how many of the OBCs are really MOBCs? Because these are the issues which, I mean, having spent many years in India, knowing all the people in the system, I mean, my colleagues at Deccan College and at MSU are dealing with these issues. You know, is this person really an OBC, or are they not an OBC, or are they ST or not ST? We need to fill this position, so the paperwork gets done and the position is filled. And so that's why Delhi University will not let you look at their data, because if you do, you will find probably lots of problems. So I just, you know, it's great to see all the numbers, and I really commend you on that, but having seen the reality behind the scenes in departments all over India, I'm wondering, you know, how real these data are in terms of the actual people who are in the positions.
Yeah, so I mean, the data is reported by the household.
Yeah.
Now, so the self-reporting issue is a major issue in these data. I mean, I should recognize that first. So there can be two kinds of problems. They may not know whether they are OBC or not, which is unlikely. The other problem is that they may report themselves as OBC expecting some benefits out of it, right? So since we had a couple of sociologists working with us on the committee, and we did a micro kind of a survey around Lucknow and so on, and to look at some of this. And once again, I should say that the small sample and so on, the results were not very different, right? So it is, if a sociologist in our committee is happy with what's happening, but your point is absolutely well taken, and that was the first thing which many of the critics of the such a committee report said, that data doesn't make sense. We don't really know whether they are SCs or STs or OBCs. You are sort of throwing up these numbers all over the place. But the fact is that the NCAR data, which collects information, something similar information, gives you broadly the same results. Not so much in education, but all the other things that we did for Muslims. So that gives you some confidence. But one way is to say that the data is bad, that it's not analyzed, although it's
it's nice to hear that there's been another way to show that the patterns are
at least in the such a committee report thing, we had other sets of data which showed similar results. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Rakesh, so I have two quick questions. One of them is, what explains the fact that Muslims do better in the rural areas? And second, you said that you have looked at the data in different time periods, but it seems, can you say something about whether formative action in the 80s made a difference in the 90s? Is there a time effect here? And is that, or the time assessments were cross-sectional and they're just about different time periods rather than the effect of time or effect of a formative action over time?
Yeah, so that I will tell you 2 months from now. The data, we have done that for different years, and now we need to figure out how the coefficients are changing over a period of time for different groups, right? But to get at your question more rigorously would require us to know whether the parents of these people had benefited from this. So what we are trying to do right now is to get at the parental education. And if they belong to a OBC, SC, ST, the parents may have benefited. And so the parental education impact, after controlling for all the other variables, if that is very high, then that might give us some clues as to that. But otherwise, at the moment, what we're doing is whether the importance of SC, being an SC, is declining or increasing over a period of time, controlling for everything else. If it is declining, that means that controlling other facts, their identity is not as important anymore. But that's something which we are writing up right now. The data is estimates to be done.
And Muslims in rural, why are they better in rural areas?
So the once again, it's a hypothesis. So if you look at the Muslim population in rural areas, so it is in the northeast belt. They are somewhat landed. So the so that may be one of the reasons for. But I don't really know clearly. Basically, I'm saying hypothesis that the asset composition of Muslims in urban and rural areas are different. But in general, whatever data you look at from Muslims, urban areas, Muslims are worse off, whether it is in terms of sanitation or in terms of extent of poverty. All those numbers are worse for Muslims in urban areas. Okay, thank you very much.